Hello and welcome to the Missing Faces in Teaching YouTube channel. Today is presentation 4. Now today's session is going to focus or continue with the evidence in Europe. Belgium, France and Germany will feature quite heavily today, with a major emphasis on Belgium and how through onomastics, the study of surnames and place names in history, you will see how those surnames move and migrate and reveal the foundational black cultures of those regions and how they logically form into the nobles, the elites and the leading families. Now, if I could just spend a little bit of time on this first slide, you will notice that we have Van Duffel from Antwerp in Belgium. This is a very, very interesting surname because it begins in Belgium and migrates into Scotland. We find that it becomes, from the literature, that Duffel becomes Duff and is a form of the Gaelic dub, but it is pronounced as Duff. We find the name in Kintyre in Scotland and Aberdeen. Duffy, spelt with an IE, also is a form of the MacPhee surname. We find Duff Town in Banffshire and the lands of Duffus in Moray in Scotland. Now we can see that this particular family from Antwerp in Belgium are wealthy. They are moving into the lands, owning the lands and setting up their own businesses and commerce. Now I have traced the surname Duffel into the town Duffel in Belgium, and they were manufacturers of textiles, and the town itself was named after them, and this is where we get the name duffel. We have a duffel coat here. I'm not sure how that translates overseas, but here in Britain we have the very famous duffel coat. And so here we have the founders of that particular surname as wealthy landowners. We also find the House of Albrecht is found in Flanders in Belgium and France and Spain. The House of Albrecht moves into Germany as Albrecht, you see. And so we find some of those vowel changes moving, but they're all still melanated people. And so as we move on and we look into the map onto the next slide, you will see the very famous Albrecht Dürer. And so it's important that we keep in mind that many of these particular crests, those on the first slide, are well over 700 years old. And so those foundational families are there from the beginning. And it's very, very critical that we keep this concept in our minds, even when we're looking at the maps. You see, a lot of my research focuses on the whole of Europe, so that I am constantly keeping all of those regions in real time, but anciently in my own head in terms of what I'm finding with the research, so that the advantages of focusing on France and Germany and Britain and Belgium is that, yes, the micro side of the research takes up a lot of time, but I'm able to find the constants and the consistencies across the regions and the families. Now, Albert or Albrecht, because its original form is, it becomes Albert into Britain, but its origin is Albrecht. And Albrecht Dürer is a famous German artist. And as you can see, you he's depicting himself through his coat of arms. And what he's doing in the late 15th century is that he's actually painting a lot of these original heraldic crests and these coats of arms. And yes, as we would expect, later Europeans have depicted him as a Caucasian or a later European, but he's a very famous artist, a very famous German artist, and you can go online and you can see his house, which is now a museum. But he's painting these very, very important noble families. And you can see that he painted Hieronymus Holzschuher, was born in Nuremberg, and we see that on the map. And I also have, but I can't show today because it would just be way too much information and visuals, is that I have, as one might expect, I have hundreds of these original priests, wise ones, or the clergy, because they were kind of running the nation, which I will go into on another presentation. But Albrecht is a very famous German artist, and what they were doing, which I'm finding absolutely fascinating, is that they were drawing upon ancient artistic and spiritual concepts, because you see Albrecht has depicted himself with wings, and we find those particular iconographic representations in ancient Kemet, the wings which always symbolized the barbed of the human soul, and the outstretched wings was a sign of intellect and spiritual ascendancy. And so what they were doing was that they were maintaining all of these sacred concepts and ways of being into their heraldic crests. Those heraldic crests are actually semiotic texts, and they are very, very deep symbolic stories encapsulated in an image, in an instant image, and they were maintaining those traditions. And so we ask ourselves, why is Belgium so important? But I would also extend that and say, why is the whole of Europe important? Because we will keep getting back to those foundational black founders, the primordial populations. We find that Belgium, as a royal nation, is shown in the literature and the evidence. And we find here to the left that the king and his royal court of Belgium. Who are they? And so the literature shows us, and this is in issue 12, that the Roman de Gillian de Trasnegni is a compelling, multifaceted work that combines elements of romance, adventure, chivalry, travel, and medieval European fascination with culture. We learn that the romance's titular character is Gillian de Trasegni, and he is a noble knight from the country of Hainaut. Hainaut in Belgium, which is also the birthplace of Richard II's grandmother, Philippa of Hainaut. And she becomes Queen of England, you see. And when you go back and look at the map and you get that geospatial relationship, you see how easy the migrations would have been across, literally a hop, skip and a jump away. And so we find that the indigenous populations of Belgium were the Belgae, the kinfolk of the Picts. And they become the Atrebates, the Parisii and the Britanni, all British tribes having kinsmen on the continent, you see. But much of our seamlessness, connection with history has been totally severed, so that we never actually made the connection. And as we will see over to the right, you will see that double image of the crest of Lord Jean Baron de Tresny. Now, I showed that on another presentation. I think it was 2. And we find that that particular family, ancient noble family from the province of Hainaut, same region as Queen Philippa, is that there is a beautiful castle, as one might expect, because many of these noble families were living in these beautiful castles. So I urge you to go and have a look at that. You can see that castle online. But this is a very, very important slide because it's showing the nobility and the royalty in Belgium. The royalty were in France, in Germany, in Britain, and Belgium. We have to keep in mind when we're looking at these beautiful heraldic crests from the original royalty of Belgium that they don't just appear out of nowhere. They have a deep, deep ancient beginning. And so as we look at the primordial cultures, as many of the listeners know about the ancient cultures of the whole of Europe and the work of Diop and Boulay and Valois and so on, that those populations would logically, inevitably become the landowners. And so when we look at these particular crests, we must always keep in our minds of what has gone before, so that the evidence is always building upon what is happening in relatively early times, like the 15th and 16th centuries. So for example, in issue 17, we find that in 1928, René Bailly found in one of the caverns of Maniat near Dinant in Belgium a human skeleton whose age is difficult to be certain, but is definitely ancient. It is remarkable for its negroid characteristics, which give it a resemblance to the same skeletons from Grimaldi, France and the Italian border, and Assalar in West Africa. It seems that there are at least an Aurignacian race, which is dated to 37,000 years ago. We find in the caves of Derbyshire. You see, this is where tying the cultural continuities is critical with the evidence. So the caves in Derbyshire in Britain and in Kent, and at Angus in Belgium and in France, where again there is a negroid tendency. Finally, Diop says that negroids survived everywhere from up until the Neolithic period, which is about 5,000 years ago, Spain, Portugal, Belgium and the Balkans. You see, that foundation is critical, you see, and they're showing us that when you look at these particular crests on this slide, they're wearing crowns, they're wearing all of the insignia, royal insignia of nobility. You see, this particular crest here to the right is showing what has been named the checkerboard pattern, but it's actually the quartering around a fifth, or the Dogon philosophy captured on that sleeve, on that shield. I talk about that in many of the issues. But these beautiful crests are the representations of Belgian nobility. And so Belgium, or Liège, or Liège, I apologize for my pronunciation, in Belgium is where Charlemagne was born in the late 740s. I cannot tell you how excited I am with this particular slide. This evidence, to me, is a game changer It's such an important slide that I really want to spend a little bit of time on this, because I believe this is the first ever presentation in which the real Charlemagne is shown today. It's very, very exciting. But just before we get onto him, we find that, again, keeping it in context of from Belgium, these deeply melanated royals that would flourish and be born and continue their power across the seas, we find that Richard's grandmother, Queen Philippa of Hainault of Belgium, is described in 1319 by Bishop Stapledon. And what does he say? This is in issue 17. He says that her lips are somewhat full, especially the lower lip, and all her limbs are well set. Moreover, she is brown of skin all over, much like her father, and in all things she's pleasant enough, as it seems. And so Bishop Stapledon is describing her from a primary source text on the phenotype of this Belgian noble woman who would become Queen of England. And so when we look at Richard II, I found that quite interesting, that he was noted for his beauty. Now, mainstream literature like to call him the Narcissus King, that somehow he was unstable, that he didn't know how to govern properly, that he had kind of a wicked character. But again, the primary source evidence reveals that the king's humanity was well known. And he says here, there's a whole page here, so I'll just read the essential bits. So a thief was caught red-handed at Westminster Hall and sentenced to be hanged. And while the Deputy Marshal of the King's Bench was in the process of executing the judgment, the King happened to pass by, Richard II, and he ordered him by word of mouth to delay execution. Shortly afterwards, the culprit received a royal pardon. And then it goes on, and you will see in issue 17 more examples of this very balanced king who had a real generous heart. That's very, very interesting. And so Charlemagne he's born in this ancient region of Belgium where we find all of those primordial populations. So it's a logical outcome that he would be born there. He could have been born in France or Germany, because these are all deeply melanated populations. But Charlemagne, as you can see from his vestment, that he is a black man. And Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, was Emperor of Europe. And at his death in 814, the Emperor Charlemagne ruled over much of what we call France and Germany, the Low Countries, and modern Italy. He was known as Father of Europe, and the Charlemagne building in Brussels today has been built in honour of his legacy. Now, if we just think about today, because as Dr. Clark reminds us, all history is a current event, you see, by understanding what is happening from these ancient foundational populations, how they have completely removed the black element, so that when we look at Charlemagne, his legacy lives on. And here now that we must saturate our mind and our psychological faculty with this correct image of Charlemagne, who is the father of Europe. Imagine that we now have the evidence to say that a black man was the father of Europe. Charlemagne, the father of Europe, with his beautiful black afro, on this particular slide shows the many conceptual links, and also through onomastics, through surnames, his wide reaching stretch of arc and time across geography, and how in France and Germany and Britain we find a connection. So Charlemagne was buried at Aachen in Germany. Now, I'll come back to that, but recent excavations have also revealed evidence of an 8th century royal palace at the part of Saint Denis or Denis complex. This is where we get the name Denis from, as you can see from this particular crest with 3 black heads. Charlemagne, the Frankish Germanic emperor, was Le Roi de Saint Denis. This is where we get, or the king of Saint Denis. Le Roi is where we find the name Leroy, which means king. And so Denis or Denis, as you will see on the map, is found in France. But let's just go back to Germany, where he was buried. Charlemagne was buried at Aachen. Now, Aachen is related to Richard, Earl of Cornwall in Britain, who was Henry III's brother. We find a connection there in Germany. In issue 17, we find that he made in 1262, this is Richard Earl of Cornwall in the same city that Charlemagne is buried in. In 1262, he made a remarkable move of presenting a new set of regalia to Aachen and entrusting it jointly to the city of St. Mary's. There's a whole page here on it. Let me just read the other bits. But this was a magnificent building, now decorated and used for the city archives. It was magnificent, so that Richard's part in it may have been another aspect of his policy of elevating Aachen's status as a coronation city. That's quite incredible. So that we have this British connection from Cornwall influencing and moving into Germany in terms of its policy and its regalia, its coronation regalia. You see, that's very important. Now, I've also found, which I do talk about in issue 17, that unsurprisingly, that the building that Richard originally was part of has now undergone major modifications, and the statues of the 7 electors have been replaced. You see, they've removed all of the original melanated connections from that particular building, but primary source evidence will take you back to the beginning, to the founders, every time. We also find that Charlemagne's nephew was Roland, who was a member of the royal house of Saint Denis or Denis. And the literature shows us that the Song of Roland and Maurian, you see the crests here of Van Maurian from France and Germany, that it included a substantial cast of dark-skinned characters, many of whom are described in less than flattering language. And so Charlemagne's family, because these are all family members, would inevitably naturally be dark-skinned individuals who have prominent roles in history. And so I was just looking at that. I was a little bit distracted by looking at the name. We look at Maurian, which we find all over Scotland and Britain and actually the globe. But we see its origins from France and being connected to Charlemagne. Is that the very famous singer, is he from Ireland? Van Morrison. You see, this is where he gets his name from. Van Morian becomes Morrison or Morrissey. And so when we look at all of the evidence, it seems as though it's coming to us in bits and pieces. But as I iterate time and time again, it is a jigsaw puzzle that must be put back together again. It's a complex picture, but actually all of those discrete, kind of isolated, disjointed pieces actually come together to make and form a picture, a coherent picture that actually makes sense. And one of the abiding messages that I keep getting, the deeper and deeper I get into this research, is basically how rich the history is. You know, the depth and the absolute tapestry of shades and angles of brilliance. And so as we come to the end of another presentation, I urge you to purchase the MFIT magazines, the journals on Amazon. I receive no funding at all to carry out this research, so I would appreciate your continued support, and I thank you for your time. Until next time, MFIT will be back with more evidence. Ku Amsha, to awaken.